this morning is from Ephesians 4, verses 7, 11 to 16. Each of us was given grace according to the measure of God's gift. The gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity in the faith and of knowledge of the Son of God, and to our maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro, and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. But we must be speaking the truth in love. We must grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, and is part of it all working properly, promotes the body growth in the building itself of love.
For the past 6 years, I've served on the Committee on Ministry, which I'm going to call the committee. You don't need to hear all of that all the time, for the Pacific Northwest Conference of the United Church of Christ. We'll call that the conference. I'm nearing the end of 3 years as co-chair of the committee, which is about a third-time job, sometimes close to full-time. Now, when I mention this committee to people, most people have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. But our work is so central to the polity, that's the process that the United Church of Christ uses to reflect our theology. It's so central to the polity of the UCC that I just want to share with you some of what we do on your behalf. So the Committee on Ministry is responsible, this is what I usually say and it means nothing to people, but I'll say it anyway. The Committee on Ministry is responsible for everything related to ordination and authorization for ministry in the United Church of Christ. And also everything related to ministerial ethics, accountability, and discipline. Needless to say, it's a big responsibility, and we are busy. Fortunately, you'll be happy to hear we spend most of our time on ordination and authorization and support of ministers, and very little time on discipline. But make no mistake, the UCC takes clergy ethics very, very seriously, and we're serious about holding clergy accountable for any violations. But mostly we're going to talk about ordination, because that's mostly what we do. And it's the fun part. You having fun yet? Okay. First, a quick look at UCC history. Now, for some of you, this will be a review, but it's not a bad time to review. The denomination is very young, almost as young as this church. It was formed in 1957 as a merger of two denominations, the Evangelical and Reformed, which we call the ENR, and the Congregational Christian, which we call Congregational. Those are just two smaller denominations that had already merged other denominations. And in 1957, after many years of discussion and debate and discussion and whatever, they came together finally. So the two had very similar theological backgrounds in the Reformation, but they didn't operate the same way. Their polity, their process and procedure and organization had really significant differences. And as I talk through this, think about, how many of you grew up in a different denomination? Well, all of you in a different denomination, because for most of you, the UCC didn't exist yet. But you grew up in something that was just a little different than the UCC. So follow along and see if you can see which parts of this applied where you grew up, because it's kind of interesting to do. In the merger, a great deal of effort was made to ensure that both polities were incorporated in the polity of the new denomination, the UCC. And the differences and compromises are clearly seen, I think maybe most clearly seen, in the theology and process of ordination. So I'm going to oversimplify. Now this isn't going to seem overly simple to you, but believe me, it's much more complicated. So I'm going to oversimplify. The congregational theology emphasized what could be called the empowerment view of ordained minister. And this view stresses that ordained ministers are called by the people out of the community where they live, thank you, and also where they're going to serve. It's the same in this polity. And they are empowered to carry out the functions of preaching, teaching, and administering the sacraments. A minister, in this view, is no better, no more holy, no more powerful than any other Christian. He or she simply has the gifts and graces needed in that particular community at that particular time. They might be called enablers or facilitators. Ordination in this view is limited to that particular church. And they're limited to the particular functions that are needed at that time. It rejects any emphasis on the nature of the person to be ordained and does not emphasize the person's individual call from God, the kind of stuff I was talking about with the gifts. That's not what's important. What's important is what the church needs and who has the abilities to do that. This view approaches the ordination service as a covenant service between the individual and the gathered community, and the church does not ask for, need, or recognize any wider authorization. When the people elect their pastor and offer prayers and lay on hands, that person is ordained. And there is no need for any clergy to be present. Now, how many of you grew up in a denomination where the bishop had to come even for confirmation? Oh, okay. Not very many Episcopalians in here. Anyway, that was different for me. So the person's status as an ordained minister is not transferable to any other church. And that's really the essence of the first view of ordained minister that had to be combined into the UCC. And the second one is quite different. In the ENR theology, that's evangelical in form, ordination could be called the embodiment view. And this view recognizes that throughout history there have been people in every community who have religious or spiritual gifts. People who are in touch with the holy or the numinous. In all cultures, people just sort of know that some people have a presence that marks them for ministry. In Christian traditions that tend toward this view of clergy, the emphasis is on the gifts of ministry that God has given a particular person and on the call of God to that person. That is what is primary. Clergy are seen as having a special relationship and responsibility to God. The primary task of the church, therefore, is to discover and affirm what already exists between a person and God. You know the difference? Quite different. One's bottom up and the other is top down. That's the oversimplification. The ordination service in this view is hosted by the church. Well, in both views, it's hosted by the church where the person has been worshiping. But the leadership in this view, the leadership of that congregation, is not in charge of the ordination. Rather, the clergy in the whole area, authorized by regional bodies of laity and clergy, lay hands on the candidate to pass on the authority that previously was entrusted to them and to honor God's call for that particular life. Ordination understood this way is timeless, global, and indelible. You cannot be unordained. Clergy are ordained to the whole Church of Jesus Christ, or, to be realistic, to the particular denomination, and not simply to one particular congregation. For this reason, in the ENR tradition, clergy did not belong to a particular church, like what we have now. Roberta is a member of this church. They were not members of any church. They were members of the Synod, which was the larger body. So how does the UCC compromise these two very different approaches? Well, we recognize ordained ministers as called both by the people and by the denomination, and underline that also by God. So how does this work? Well, the process begins with the people of the local church. Let's say there's a person in this church that feels that they are called for ordained ministry, and the church examines them and agrees. Well, then the people of the church recommend that person to the local, the regional committee on ministry. That's my committee. Okay? And they ask that we accept them as a member in discernment, or an MID, so that it used to be called in care. Some of you will know the term in care. To begin a process of discernment about whether they really are called to ministry and what that means. So if the committee, which is made up of lay people and clergy, preferably in equal numbers, from the whole region, if we accept the person as a member in discernment, then the person begins that long process of discernment and preparation. And ideally, the church stays involved. Now, that process of preparation for ordination, has traditionally included a requirement of obtaining a Master of Divinity degree from an approved seminary, an internship in a UCC church. Remember, we've had interns here. I think Kevin Bechtold was the most recent one. A psychological assessment, that's everybody's favorite thing to go through. A thorough background check, several letters of recommendation, and a number of required written documents. And it all leads up to a comprehensive ordination paper. It's about 30 pages, and it covers everything you can think about in terms of theology and ideas about the church, as well as personal background. When the MID has completed all of these and written their ordination paper, then the local church again sends a letter. This is a second letter, and it's probably been years, so it may be different people, but it's still the local church that sends a letter to the committee requesting approval for ordination. Note, the committee does not initiate any of these things. The committee responds when the local church makes a request. And then the MID comes and meets with the committee, and they basically defend their ordination paper. It's kind of like defending a dissertation. It's great fun. Many questions are asked and answered, and then assuming that the committee's vote is affirmative, the MID is approved for ordination pending a call. But it's not time to start planning an ordination service yet. There's one more major hurdle, one more call. How many calls have we had so far? A bunch. The local church, the denomination, the person's relationship with God. We use call for all of those. So they have to have a call traditionally from a church that wants them to come and serve as their pastor. So when we agreed that we wanted Roberta, we made a call to her. And it's basically a contract. But it's a contract in the form of a covenant. What will she do? What will we do? So on. But they have to be approved for ordination pending a call before they can even seek a call, before they can even circulate a profile. And only when that call is presented to the committee, and we have to determine that it's an ordainable call. Usually if it's to be pastor of a church, it would be an ordainable call, but we got to alternatives to that. Only at that point, when the committee makes that determination, can the person be ordained. And the process began with a request from the person's church of origin, and then the request for ordination, the final request for ordination, comes from the church that's calling in. So all of those have to happen. Typically, the ordination service is held in the church that began the process, the person's church of origin. And who officiates? Anybody? It could be anything with those two backgrounds, couldn't it? There are a lot of people in the UCC, and I have to admit, when I joined the UCC, when I started seminary, I thought that it had to be the conference minister, and often it is the conference minister. But it doesn't have to be. In fact, the conference minister is not in charge of anything in this process. It's the Committee on Ministry that authorizes the ordination, and increasingly, in many conferences, and including this one, it is the Committee on Ministry that someone from the Committee on Ministry, often one of the co-chairs, but not necessarily, who officiates at the ordination. For example, I co-officiated at an ordination 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to officiate at one next week. So who's involved in the laying on of hands? There is a laying on of hands. Does anybody remember how it's done here? We haven't done an ordination in a long time. I remember distinctly when I was ordained in this room. It was 90 degrees. Jamie remembers, I was staying with her. It was 90 degrees, it was about 90% humidity. They robed me in this wool robe, and I knelt, and every single person in the room came and laid hands on me. I thought I was going to die. It was very, very hot. But it's a wonderful thing. It is not just a bishop or a conference minister, and it isn't even just clergy. It's everyone who is involved in the laying on of hands. It's truly a blending of the different traditions. Now, I want to mention two relatively new variations of this ordination process, just very quickly. In UCC talk, I think we would say, God is still speaking and we're struggling to keep up. Because things are changing, and they're changing in UCC polity as well as everywhere else. So first is the alternative track to ministry, to ordained ministry. And it's actually been around for a while, but the committees on ministry are just catching up. And it comes from the idea that there is more than one way to learn all the things that one needs to know to be an ordained minister. And seminary is the traditional way, but it isn't the only way. And so we now occasionally are presented with somebody that a church presents to us and says, we think this person is ready for ordained ministry, and they don't have a seminary degree. And not only that, they're not planning to go and get one. And after much resistance, we have come to the conclusion that they're right. There are times. Say somebody has worked in a number of churches in a number of different positions. They know a whole lot more about church and how to do church than some of us who went to seminary. So it's our responsibility to make sure we don't compromise the denomination's emphasis on educated clergy, while recognizing that they may have learned everything that was important somewhere else. And then occasionally and increasingly, somebody asks to be ordained, or their church comes to us and asks us to ordain them, and they're not going to have a call to be a pastor in a church. Now, the one way that this has happened in the past is when the person is going to be a chaplain. But in most occasions, chaplains have actually been pastors in churches before they became chaplains, and that fits the polity neatly. Now, we have all sorts of people being presented. I'm just going to tell you about one of them. We recently recognized a call to ministry of liturgical drama. Liturgical drama. I love it. This person's ministry involves guest worship leadership throughout the conference. She goes from church to church to whatever church invites her to come. So, for example, if we were to invite her to lead worship here some Sunday, she would meet ahead of time with whoever in the congregation wants to meet with her and do a Bible study. And they would do an in-depth Bible study on some Bible passage. And I've seen how she does it. It's great. And then this minister would take all her, she frantically takes notes, and she would take all of her notes and she would put them together in a monologue or a dialogue, a different way of presenting the scripture that she would bring back to the church, and people who were part of that Bible study would present it. So she wouldn't be standing up here as an actress, although that's her background. She would be the coach, and the people in the congregation would be doing it. I have observed her ministry, and I've been very impressed. It's fun. And it's different things come out. Some of you who've done a lot of Bible study know sometimes lay people have wonderful insights that a minister would never think of. I think I had some of my best before I was ordained. Anyway, I hope someday she'll come here. Anyway, that's a little bit of what we do in as regards ordination. But one little paragraph on accountability and discipline. The UCC has strict ethical standards for clergy and a detailed process for handling allegations of abuse. The UCC is, and sometimes I hear questions about this, the UCC is very aware, as probably all of you are, that many clergy in various denominations have been transferred or have chosen to transfer themselves to a new church and maybe a new state, a new location, in order to avoid ethical questions, allegations of abuse. Our process absolutely does not allow this. Now, we're not perfect, but we have a process that's pretty darn good. And it would be very difficult for somebody who had allegations of abuse against them that had not yet been resolved to transfer to another church. And personally, that makes me feel. I've been part of it, and I know it works. To serve as UCC clergy or to seek a call as UCC clergy, a person must have ministerial standing in the conference in which the church is located. That's a little bit like having to be a member of the bar in the state where you're going to practice. You could be a lawyer without having that, but in order to practice in a particular area, you have to have that standing. So, when we hold a disciplinary investigation, that's called a fitness review. Fitness for ministry is what we're looking at. There are a whole lot of possible results, from exoneration through a whole bunch of other things to removal of standing. That's the ultimate. We don't remove ordination. Ordination is for life. But we can remove standing, which removes the ability to transfer to a new call in a new location. And we use this remedy if we need to. I personally have been involved in removal of standing proceedings both in Massachusetts and in Washington. It's a serious remedy, and we don't take it lightly. But occasionally, it's necessary. So I want to end with just a couple of words about how I ended up serving on the Committee on Ministry in the Pacific Northwest Conference. When I was ordained in this church in 1996, the process in this conference was not rigorous. It was not. They did not require much of anything besides an ordination paper and a degree from seminary. Frankly, it was sloppy. In short, they approved me for ordination without knowing very much about me. I sent them some things from seminary that would have told them, but nobody read them. I was shocked. And so I said, you know how you do sometimes, I said in the silence of my heart, well, if I ever come back to the Pacific Northwest, I'd like to serve on the Committee on Ministry and work to be sure it functioned better. Well, that's a dangerous kind of thing to say, even to yourself. For very soon after I moved back here, I was invited to serve on the Committee on Ministry. And I was invited by a nominating committee of people I had never met, not a single one of them. I couldn't refuse, of course. But how did they know? Well, as I said to the children, I intended to at least, I'm never sure what I actually said to them. God is always looking for people who are willing to do what needs to be done. And God is infinitely patient. And when that nominating committee invited me to serve, there was no doubt in my mind that I was being called, both by the people and by God. And I will say, the conference was already doing it a whole lot better than they had when I was ordained. Now, if anybody asks you if you know how the polity of the United Church of Christ works, you can say, yeah, I know enough. I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody has any. I know some of you are more interested in this stuff than others, but it's, to me, it's fascinating how the merger worked. So now it's time for you to, oh no it isn't, wait a second. Oh, different thing. It's time for our offering. It's time for us to dig deep and share with the church our resources to help the church's work and God's work be done. Will the ushers come forward, please?